In ancient China, punishments were often harsh and cruel, intended to deter criminal behavior, shame, and humiliate the offender. From public executions to less severe forms of punishment like forced labor, the methods used varied depending on the crime's severity. While some of these punishments may seem barbaric by today's standards, they offer a glimpse into ancient China's social, cultural, and legal systems, and remind us of the importance of justice and fairness in any society. This video will explore the 10 worst punishments in ancient China, examining their origins, implementation, and impact on society. Number 1. Ling Qi. Ling Qi, or death by 1,000 cuts, was a gruesome and brutal punishment that people widely used in ancient China. The punishment involved the slow and methodical slicing of the flesh, resulting in a slow and painful death. Ling Qi was most common during the Qing dynasty, which ruled from 1644 to 1912. During this time, people used Ling Qi for various crimes, including high treason, unaliving, and rebellion. It was considered one of the most severe forms of punishment in ancient China and served as a warning to others who might consider committing similar crimes. The process of Ling Qi was often carried out in public, with crowds of people gathering to watch the gruesome spectacle. The criminal would be tied to a wooden frame, and the executioner would use a sharp weapon to make minor, shallow cuts on the criminal's body, taking off little by little. The executioner would take his time, often stopping to rest or eat, before returning to continue the torture. The process would continue for several hours or even days, until the criminal finally passed from their injuries. The goal was not for the process to be quick, but to make the punishment as painful and drawn out as possible. Despite its widespread use, Ling Qi was also a controversial form of punishment. Many people criticized its cruelty and brutal nature, and there were efforts to abolish it. During the Ming Dynasty, for example, people limited the use of Ling Qi to cases of high treason and other serious crimes against the state. However, the abolition of Ling Qi took time and continued to be used in some parts of China well into the 20th century. Only in the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949 did the government finally abolish the use of Ling Qi throughout the country. The reasons behind the abolition of Ling Qi varied. Some argued that it was too inhumane and that it violated fundamental human rights. Others argued that it was ineffective as a deterrent, as it often occurred in public places and was seen as a spectacle rather than a severe punishment. Some also pointed out that corrupt officials often abused the punishment, as they would use it to extract confessions from innocent people. Number 2. Boiling. Boiling to death was one of ancient China's most brutal and gruesome forms of punishment. It was reserved for those who had committed the most heinous of crimes, such as treason, rebellion, or murder. The punishment was intended not only to serve as a deterrent, but also to demonstrate the power and authority of the ruling class. The process involved placing the condemned individual into a large cauldron filled with boiling water or oil. The individual would be submerged in the boiling liquid in a public setting, with large crowds often gathering to witness the spectacle. One of the critical reasons that boiling was used as a form of punishment in ancient China was to instill fear in the population. Another reason boiling was used as a punishment was to provide closure for the victims' families. The belief was that the severity of the punishment would match the severity of the crime and that justice would be served. The punishment was intended to provide a sense of closure for the victims' families and demonstrate that the ruling class could enforce the law and punish those who dared to break it. This punishment was used throughout ancient Chinese history, from the Zhou dynasty to the Qing dynasty. However, the exact frequency of its use and the specific circumstances under which officials applied it varied from dynasty to dynasty and from region to region. During the Zhou dynasty, boiling to death was one of the many forms of punishment used by the ruling class to maintain social order. The Book of Rites, a text from the Zhou dynasty, describes the punishment in detail. The Han dynasty, which was known for its use of cruel and unusual punishments, was another period in which they commonly used boiling. During the Tang dynasty, boiling was still used as a punishment, but it became less common as the dynasty progressed. Number 3. The wooden horse. In ancient China, the wooden horse, known as jiyin, was used for punishment and agony. Officials primarily used it on women who were accused of adultery, prostitution, or other crimes that were considered immoral or shameful. This punishment was intended to humiliate and shame the woman in question and warn other women in the community. The wooden horse was a long, narrow beam supported by 2 legs or pedestals. The beam was often carved with intricate designs, and it was usually made of hardwood such as elm or oak. The woman being punished was made to straddle the beam, with her hands tied behind her back and her feet bound to the legs of the horse. The height of the horse was adjusted to ensure that the woman's weight was concentrated on her genital area, causing extreme pain and discomfort. The punishment could last for hours or even days, during which time the woman was exposed to the elements and to public scrutiny. In some cases, the woman was paraded through the streets on the wooden horse. Then, she would be placed in a public square or market where the crowd jeered and mocked her. In addition to the physical discomfort and pain, the wooden horse punishment also carried a significant social stigma. Women who were punished in this way were often shunned by their families and communities, and they were considered to be social outcasts. They might be unable to find a husband or marry into a respectable family, and were often forced to live a life of poverty and shame. The use of the wooden horse punishment declined over time, and it was eventually abolished in China in the early 20th century. However, the legacy of this cruel and degrading punishment remains, and serves as a reminder of how women have been oppressed and marginalized throughout history. Number 4. Castration. Castration was a punishment used primarily during the Ming and Qing dynasties for crimes such as treason, rebellion, and corruption. While it may sound like a brutal punishment, it was viewed as a merciful alternative to the death penalty, allowing the offender to live while preventing them from reproducing. Leaders introduced the practice of castration during the Ming dynasty and was primarily used on eunuchs who served in the imperial court. These eunuchs were considered trustworthy and loyal servants, as they had no political or family ties that could compromise their service to the emperor. However, castration as a punishment was also used on non-eunuchs who committed serious crimes against the state. The procedure involved the removal of the male genitals, which a specially trained surgeon typically performed. The offender was then exiled to a distant location to live the rest of their life as a eunuch. They were not allowed to marry or have children, and instead had to serve the emperor or his officials. While castration was seen as a lenient punishment compared to the death penalty, it was still a traumatic experience for those who underwent the procedure. The loss of their reproductive organs affected not only their physical health, but also their mental and emotional well-being. The stigma associated with being a eunuch was also a significant factor in their social exclusion and discrimination. During the Qing dynasty, castration as a form of punishment was gradually abolished. This was due to a combination of factors, including a shift towards more humane punishments and a decline in the use of eunuchs in the imperial court. The abolition of castration was also influenced by the introduction of Western legal systems and the increasing pressure from foreign powers to reform China's legal system. Number 5. The 9 familial exterminations. As well as creative torture and execution methods, some Chinese emperors were ruthless regarding who suffered. The 9 familial exterminations is a good example. When emperors condemned a person for crimes like treason, the emperor may also choose to punish 8 other levels of their family, which meant their children, parents, grandparents, siblings, in-law, parents-in-law, aunts, and uncles, often by a method like lingqi. Emperors could change rules depending on who the emperor was at any given time. Some were more lenient than others, sometimes sparing children under a certain age or allowing women to become enslaved rather than suffer death. In one case, Fang Xiaoru, a scholar in the Ming dynasty, was executed because he was perceived as a political threat by the Yongle Emperor, who had usurped the throne from the Jianwen Emperor, whom Fang had supported. The Yongle Emperor feared that Fang and other supporters of the Jianwen Emperor might try to overthrow him and restore the previous emperor to power. The emperor also decided to include his students and executed 873 people. Although not as brutal as in ancient China, punishing an individual's entire family for their crimes has also been employed in various forms in many societies throughout history, including ancient China, Japan, Korea, India, and the Middle East. In ancient Rome, a similar practice known as damnatio memoriae involved erasing the legacy of individuals deemed enemies of the state, including their family members. It often included destroying their property and monuments and removing their names from official records. In medieval Europe, there were also instances of punishing the families of criminals. For example, in England during the Middle Ages, the practice of outlawry allowed the authorities to confiscate the property of criminals and banish them and their families from the community. Number 6. Amputation. Amputation was a severe punishment in ancient China for various crimes, including theft, rebellion, and treason. We can trace the history of amputation in China back to the Qin dynasty. The practice of amputation was not limited to China, but was also used in other societies throughout history. For example, in ancient Rome, amputation was used as a form of punishment for crimes such as adultery, theft, and murder. In medieval Europe, amputation was used as a punishment for crimes such as treason, heresy, and blasphemy. In ancient China, the use of amputation as a punishment was particularly severe. It inflicted physical pain and carried a social stigma that would follow the offender for the rest of their life. In many cases, offenders who had undergone amputation were stripped of their social status and forced to live as outcasts. The types of amputation used in ancient China varied depending on the crime and the offender's status. For example, for lesser crimes such as theft, the offender might have a finger or a hand amputated, while more serious crimes such as rebellion or treason could result in the loss of a limb or even the entire body. The amputation process was typically carried out using a large weapon and was often performed publicly to deter others from committing similar crimes. The offender was usually tied to a wooden block or held down by several people to prevent them from moving during the procedure. The aftermath of amputation was often just as tricky as the punishment itself. Offenders who had undergone amputation were often left with permanent disabilities, such as difficulty walking or performing daily tasks. They were also forced to live with the social stigma of their punishment, often making it difficult to find work or marry. Despite the severity of the punishment, amputation was not always effective as a deterrent. Some offenders, particularly those who were desperate or mentally ill, continued to commit crimes even after undergoing amputation. It led some officials to question the punishment's effectiveness and advocate for more humane forms of punishment. Over time, the use of amputation as a punishment in China began to decline, particularly during the Ming and Qing dynasties. These dynasties introduced new forms of punishment, such as imprisonment and hard labor, which were considered more humane and effective. Number 7. Tattooing the face. When we think of tattoos, we often think of them as a form of self-expression or a way to commemorate important events or people. However, in ancient China, tattoos were a punishment for criminals. The practice of tattooing as a punishment dates back to the Han Dynasty. During this time, tattoos were used to mark criminals and enslaved people and were often placed on the face or forehead to signify their crime. For example, those convicted of theft might have a tattoo of a hand, while those convicted of adultery might have a tattoo of a broken mirror. In addition to facial tattoos, it was common for convicted criminals to have their foreheads branded with the characters convict or criminal. This was another form of public shaming that left the person permanently marked as a criminal. The tattoos themselves were not necessarily gruesome or painful. Still, they were a form of public humiliation and a permanent reminder of the individual's status as a criminal or enslaved person. This was seen as a way to deter others from committing similar crimes and to maintain social order. While facial tattoos were considered a severe punishment, they were not always reserved for the most serious crimes. Sometimes people were tattooed for minor offenses, such as gambling or prostitution. The use of tattoos as a punishment began to decline during the Tang Dynasty. This was due in part to the influence of Buddhism, which taught compassion and the importance of treating others with kindness and respect. In addition, the Tang Dynasty was known for its emphasis on education and the arts. Many officials and scholars felt that tattooing was a barbaric practice that did not align with the values of their society. As a result, the use of tattoos as a punishment gradually fell out of favor. Thankfully today, tattoos are a popular form of self-expression and art, and are often seen as a way to celebrate individuality and creativity. Number 8. Hard labor. Hard labor, also known as penal labor, was a common punishment in ancient China. It involved convicts performing physically demanding tasks, such as mining, construction, or farming, often under harsh and brutal conditions. The use of hard labor was intended to serve as a deterrent to potential criminals, while also providing a source of cheap labor for the state. In ancient China, hard labor was typically used as a punishment for many offenses, including theft, bribery, prostitution, and drug trafficking. The severity of the punishment would depend on the nature of the crime and the offender's social status. Convicts sentenced to hard labor were often sent to remote areas of the country, such as mines, quarries, or salt pans, where they were forced to work long hours under grueling conditions. Many convicts passed away from exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease, and the mortality rate among penal laborers was often high. The use of hard labor as a punishment was also seen as a way to control the labor force and maintain social order. For example, in the Han Dynasty, convicts were used as laborers to construct public works projects, such as the Great Wall of China, and for military campaigns, allowing the state to save on labor costs and maintain a large workforce without having to rely on free labor or conscription. Hard labor continued to be used as punishment throughout Chinese history, and it was only in the modern era that the practice began to be phased out. In 1957, the Chinese government abolished penal labor as a punishment, citing concerns about human rights abuses and the need to modernize the penal system. Number 9. Flaying. In ancient China, flaying was one of the most severe forms of punishment, reserved for the most heinous crimes such as treason, rebellion, and regicide. The use of flaying as a punishment in ancient China dates back to at least the Shang dynasty, but was more commonly used during the Zhou dynasty. Officials finally abolished the practice during the Song dynasty. Flaying was used as a deterrent against potential criminals and to extract information from prisoners. The process of flaying was excruciatingly painful, and it could take hours for the victim to pass. Different methods of flaying were used in ancient China, depending on the crime and the status of the victim. Sharp weapons were reserved for commoners, and the process was pretty straightforward. For nobles and high-ranking officials, however, the process was done slowly and carefully to preserve the body's shape for public display. In some cases, people also used the skin for other purposes. It was sometimes tanned and made into leather goods or displayed as a warning to others. In rare cases, they even used the skin to make drums, which they believed to have special powers. One of the most infamous examples of flaying in ancient China was the execution of the rebel leader Fang La during the Song dynasty. Fang La had led a rebellion against the Song dynasty and took control of several southern China cities. When the Song forces finally captured him, they flayed him in public and hung his skin on display as a warning to others who might dare to challenge the government's authority. Many Chinese emperors and empresses loved flaying their detractors. The Hongwu emperor in particular, he ordered the flaying of 5,000 women in 1396. 10. Wooden collar. The wooden collar, also known as the kang, was a form of punishment used in ancient China for various crimes, including theft, fraud, and embezzlement. The kang was a large, heavy wooden frame that was designed to fit around the neck of the offender and prevent them from moving or lying down comfortably. The history of the kang can be traced back to the Song dynasty, when it was used as a form of punishment for officials who were found guilty of corruption. During this time, it was also used as a means of public shaming, as offenders were often forced to wear it for extended periods while parading through the streets. Over time, the use of the kang expanded to include a broader range of crimes, and it became a common punishment throughout China. The kang was particularly popular during the Ming dynasty, where it was used as a form of punishment for various crimes, including theft, forgery, and tax evasion. The design of the kang was simple yet effective. It was typically made from a single piece of wood, with holes cut out for the offender's neck and arms. The kang was often inscribed with the offender's name and the crime they had committed, as well as other details such as the date of their punishment and the name of the magistrate who had imposed it. The size and weight of the kang varied depending on the crime's severity and the offender's status. For more severe crimes, such as embezzlement or treason, the kang could weigh up to 200 pounds and be several feet long. The punishment for wearing the kang was severe and could last for days or weeks. Offenders were forced to wear the kang day and night, even while sleeping or eating. The kang made it difficult for the offender to move or lie down, causing severe discomfort and often resulting in physical and mental deterioration. In some cases, offenders were even forced to wear the kang until they passed from starvation or exhaustion. The use of the kang as a punishment was not without controversy. Many officials and scholars criticized the punishment as being too harsh and inhumane. Some argued that it violated Confucian principles of compassion and justice. In contrast, others argued that it was ineffective as a deterrent and only created further resentment and rebellion among the population. Despite these criticisms, the kang persisted throughout China for centuries and was even used in some regions until the early 20th century. After examining some of the worst punishments in ancient China, it is clear that extreme forms of punishment were a common practice in periods of authoritarianism and social unrest. Today, extreme forms of punishment are universally recognized as a violation of fundamental human rights, and there is a greater emphasis on rehabilitation and reintegration into society. Thanks for watching this video, and we'll see you in the next one.